Hey guys, we're going to talk just a little bit about poetry right now. First thing I want to start with is reading the Whitman poem on page 11. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. The point here, of course, is that there's room in the experience of poetry for both pure enjoyment and analysis. When he's listening to this astronomer and all the figures are being laid out, they're being taught how to study the stars, how to look at what the different positions of the stars mean, and how you can know what season it is and that sort of thing. When he's learning about that in a classroom, there's something missing to him, right? So he goes out and he actually looks at the stars, and there's this pure enjoyment. There's he's not analyzing this, he's not trying to learn something, he's trying to just enjoy the moment. And that's something that's really, really important about poetry. There is room for both analysis and enjoyment in every poem. Some poems lend themselves more to one than the other, right? And we expect this from movies, for instance. Some movies are just supposed to be funny and supposed to take you on this sort of interesting adventure. Some poems have similar motives. They're supposed to be funny. They're supposed to take you to this interesting world and on this interesting adventure. Some movies, however, require more analysis. They ask you to look deeper, to do some real thinking about the subject that they're tackling. Some poems do the same thing, ask you to look deeper, ask you to do some real thinking about this subject. All movies and all poems, though, have moments to just enjoy and moments to spend some time contemplating. So that's really important. I, of course, want you to analyze these poems. You're going to be writing essays on them. I want you to look deeply at these, but also just spend some time enjoying them. And getting in the habit of doing both of these things, enjoying and analyzing, while reading will really serve you well. I think you'll find the experience easier and more interesting when you're doing both of these things. In order to help with the analysis part, which is often less natural sometimes than the enjoyment part, we're going to look at some areas that we can analyze in poems. My first piece of advice in this regard is to read slowly. I have tried to pick poems that are really accessible. We're not going to read a bunch of old poetry. Most of this is fairly contemporary, but still there will be places that are difficult to understand. Please, if you are having trouble understanding a poem, take it 2 lines at a time. Read 2 lines, decide what they're saying. Almost any poem can be understood if you take it 2 lines at a time. Usually when you get in trouble is when you try to read this like 40-line poem and you're like, I have no idea what happened, because you don't think about any of it before you get to the end. So if you're having trouble understanding it, take it 2 lines at a time, decide what happens in those 2 lines, and then move on. Also, it shouldn't be a huge problem because, as I said, most of the ones I've picked should be fairly accessible. So some things to look at once you've understood what's going on in the poem, some different things that you can analyze. First is word choice, and one thing that's important to remember here is every word counts in poetry. No word is there by accident. Even more than in fiction, poets take great care in choosing each word. The words they use are far more compressed. There are fewer words. They're much more concerned about, is this the right word for this particular moment, for this particular feeling. If you don't know what a word means in a poem, it's really important that you look it up. You might also consider why a poet chose that particular word rather than a similar word, right? We all know about the thesaurus function on the computer. So why did the author pick that particular word instead of a similar word that you might find in a thesaurus? What is it about that word that makes it so right for that moment? And looking at older meanings of a word can also sometimes shed light on a poet's purpose for choosing a particular word. So if you're really interested in really digging in there and looking at specific words, definitely word choice is fair game for essays. So is figurative language. A couple of different types of figurative language. Metaphor, right? Most of us are familiar about this. Most of us learned about these in high school. One thing is compared to something else in a metaphor. So something like, that issue is a minefield for the mayor. We don't mean, of course, that the mayor is literally tiptoeing through a minefield, right? But we all understand what we're trying to say about that issue. It's an issue that the mayor sort of has to be careful in the way he talks about it, right? There are some dangerous areas of it that he wants to try to avoid, that sort of thing. Metaphors, of course, that work best in poetry, of course, are not cliches. Cliches lose their punch since we've heard them so many times before. So the challenge for a poet is to use metaphors that make sense to the readers, but that haven't been overused, which can be a real challenge. So when you see a metaphor in a poem, really think about what the author's trying to do with that. Similes are very, very similar to metaphors, but similes have the word like or as in them. So instead of saying something is something else, like that issue is a minefield, you might say that issue is like a minefield. So very, very similar things, not a huge difference oftentimes. As your book suggests, you can turn a metaphor into a simile or vice versa and see if that changes the meaning at all. Personification, another type of figurative language, attributes human qualities to things or ideas. So if you notice that in a poem, you might think about what the author's motive is for doing that. An allusion, another type of figurative language, it's very important to think about, very important to consider what cultural, historical, or religious events or ideas the author might be referring to in the poems. You will not catch all of these. No one can. No matter how much history you study, no matter what a religious expert you are, you're never going to be able to catch all of these. But be on the lookout for them, because understanding allusions really enriches your experience with the poetry. So if you feel like the author is sort of referring to a certain biblical story or a certain historical event, look a little bit up about that story or event, and learn something about it and see if that sheds light on the poems, because oftentimes it will. Finally, for figurative language, symbols. Symbols are an event or an image that suggests something more than itself. So public symbols are ones that readers will be familiar with. A flag, for instance, symbolizes patriotism. Okay? We all know that when we see a flag that it symbolizes patriotism. Contextual symbols are dependent on what's happening in the poem itself. So for example, in your book, the Frost poem on page 14, let's look at that real quick. This is just the opening lines from that poem. My long two-pointed ladder's sticking through a tree toward heaven still, and there's a barrel that I didn't fill beside it, and there may be 2 or 3 apples I didn't pick upon some bough. Okay, so in these couple opening lines, we need to think about what these apples symbolize in the context of the poem. They might be unfulfilled dreams, untaken moments, untapped opportunities. Now, apples on a tree are not always going to symbolize unfulfilled dreams. That's not a public symbol that everybody's familiar with. But in the context of this poem, unpicked apples do symbolize unfulfilled dreams or untaken opportunities. So that's a contextual symbol. So it's important to notice the sort of public symbols that most of us would recognize, and also these contextual symbols within the poems. Another area you might want to look at is the music of poetry. And it's really important to hear poetry out loud. And that's one of the things I am sorry we won't be in class together to do, is to hear these poems out loud. So I strongly encourage you to read it out loud to yourself, to each other, to roommates, boyfriends, girlfriends, parents, whatever, and hear the poetry. Oftentimes you'll find, in addition to the language just being pretty and sort of sounding beautiful, the meaning can become clearer when you hear the words. It becomes more natural when you hear the words out loud. It also helps you hear the rhythm and the rhyme of the poetry. So I really do encourage you to try that, to read it out loud. You might feel a little crazy at first, but it really can sort of help understand the meaning of the poem. There are some questions for exploring poetry on page 16 and 17 in your book. This is, again, a really great place to start. If a poem isn't making sense to you, if you just don't know where to start on analysis, try some of these questions to sort of give you that entrance into the poem. Okay, and of course, about any of these first lectures, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'm really excited to read your discussion posts on these first stories and poems.